for roughly 6.5 million Japanese. The surrender in August of 1945 was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of a journey home that would take years, and that many of them never completed. When the fighting stopped, an entire nation's worth of people was scattered across a collapsing empire. Soldiers in the field who had laid down their arms, but also colonists, engineers, clerks, farmers, wives and children, ordinary families who had built lives far from the home islands on the promise that the empire would last. They were in Manchuria and in China, in Korea and on Taiwan, on the islands of the Pacific and across Southeast Asia. Some were a short voyage from home. Others were 1,000 miles inland, behind advancing armies, with winter coming. The empire that had carried them out into the world dissolved almost overnight, and the question that remained was brutally simple, almost impossible to answer. How do you bring 6.5 million people home, across oceans and enemy lines, to a country that has been bombed flat and can barely feed the people already living in it? This is the story of that journey. The one that hit.
The Japanese have a word for it. They call it Hikiage, repatriation, the bringing back. And it became one of the largest movements of human beings in the modern history of the world. To understand its scale, you have to understand how far the empire had spread the population it now had to recover. For decades, Japan had pushed its people outward, into Korea and Taiwan, held for half a century, into Manchuria, where a vast settler project had planted hundreds of thousands of civilians on land taken for a new frontier, into China proper, into the occupied territories of Southeast Asia, and onto the scattered islands of the Pacific. By the war's end, somewhere around 6.5 million Japanese were living outside the home islands, and roughly half of them were not soldiers at all, but civilians. The surrender did not simply demobilize an army, it stranded a population. And it left the work of recovering that population to a defeated government with almost no ships, no fuel, and no power to act except as the occupying authorities allowed.
The mechanics of the problem were staggering. Moving 6.5 million people across the sea requires ships, and Japan's merchant fleet had been all but annihilated in the war, sunk by submarines and aircraft until almost nothing seaworthy remained. The navy that might have carried them home no longer existed as a fighting force, and what hulls survived were old, damaged, or already pressed to their limits. So the repatriation became a patchwork, assembled from whatever could float. Surviving naval vessels stripped of their guns and converted to carry passengers, battered cargo ships, small coastal craft. And crucially, the Americans lent a hand, providing transport ships, including the mass-produced cargo vessels known as Liberty ships, that had been built by the hundreds to win the war and were now turned to the work of unwinding it. The very industrial machine that had helped defeat Japan was now part of the apparatus carrying its people home. Even so, the ships were never enough. The repatriation could not happen all at once. It had to happen in waves, over years, region by region, with millions waiting their turn in camps and assembly points scattered across a continent.
And the people came home through a handful of ports. On the home islands, certain harbors were designated as repatriation gateways, and through them, the returning millions would pass. The most famous of them was Maizuru, a port on the Sea of Japan side of Honshu, whose name became almost synonymous with the homecoming itself. The key were ships from the Asian mainland and later from the Soviet camps would dock and unload their passengers. On the other side of the country, Sasebo in the southwest, a former naval base on Kyushu, took in vast numbers arriving from the south and the west. These ports were not built for what was asked of them. They became cities of arrival, lined with reception centers, quarantine stations, registration desks, and the machinery of sorting a flood of people who had lost almost everything. For the ones aboard the incoming ships, the first sight of the home islands after years away, after a war and a defeat and a journey across a continent, was the breakwater of a port like Manchuria rising out of the sea. But that homecoming was the easy half of the story. The hard half had happened before the ships, in the long road to the coast, and nowhere was that road harder than in Manchuria.
To understand the worst of the repatriation, you have to go to Manchuria, the Great Plain in the northeast of China, where Japan had built a puppet state and settled hundreds of thousands of its own civilians. For years, the government had encouraged ordinary families, farmers above all, to leave the crowded home islands and start again on the Manchurian frontier, promising land and a future on what was sold as the empire's new horizon. They went in their hundreds of thousands, and they put down roots. Villages, farms, schools, whole communities of Japanese settlers planted deep inside the Asian continent. They were the most exposed people in the entire empire, and almost none of them understood how exposed they were. Because in the last days of the war, the danger that fell on Manchuria did not come slowly from the sea, as it had come to the rest of the empire. It came fast, over land, from the north. In August of 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and poured its armies into Manchuria. And the settler families who had been promised a frontier suddenly found themselves directly in the path of an invasion.
The collapse was sudden and total. The Japanese army in Manchuria, hollowed out to feed other fronts, could not hold. And in many places it withdrew without warning, leaving the civilian settlers behind to fend for themselves. Families who had farmed the same land for years woke to find the protection they had counted on simply gone. The soldiers retreating south, while they were left in isolated villages with an army advancing toward them. What followed was a desperate, improvised flight. Families gathering what they could carry, abandoning homes and possessions, and setting out on foot and by overcrowded train toward the ports and the south, hundreds of miles away. They moved through a countryside that had turned hostile, in the chaos of a fallen regime, with no organization to guide them and no supplies waiting along the road. The strong walked, the old and the very young struggled, and the distances were enormous, a journey of weeks or months across open country into the teeth of the approaching winter, with the railways jammed and unreliable, and the roads choked with refugees, all trying to reach the same coast.
The cost of that flight is one of the hardest chapters of the entire war's aftermath. Exposed to cold, to hunger, to disease that swept through the crowded refugee columns and the squalid assembly camps where people waited for transport that was slow in coming, the Manchurian settlers died in numbers that are difficult to count precisely, but reach well into the tens of thousands, and by some estimates, far higher. Many never reached a port at all. Those who did often arrived after months of travel, sick and starving, only to wait again in overcrowded reception areas for a ship. The winter of 1945 and into the following year was lethal. Families that had set out together arrived broken, having lost members along the road to illness and exhaustion. For the settlers of Manchuria, the repatriation was not an orderly evacuation, but a catastrophe, and it fell hardest on exactly the people least able to bear it: the children and the elderly, the families who had gone out to the frontier in good faith and found at the end that the empire that sent them had no way to bring them back in time. And there was a further complication that delayed the return of many for years. As the Soviet armies occupied Manchuria, they took hundreds of thousands of Japanese, most of them captured soldiers, but not only soldiers, and transported them not home, but north and west, into the labor camps of Siberia and the Soviet interior. There they were held, in many cases for years, set to hard labor in the cold, and repatriated only slowly, group by group, long after the war had ended. For the families waiting in Japan, these were the missing.
Men who had not died and not come home, whose return trickled in across the late 1940s and beyond, some not reaching Japan until years had passed. The ports that received them, Manchuria above all, became places of long waiting, where families gathered ship after ship, hoping for a face that might or might not be aboard. The repatriation from the Soviet zone was the slowest and most uncertain of all, and it stretched the end of the war out across years for the people caught in it.
While the catastrophe unfolded in the north, repatriation from the rest of the empire proceeded on a vast and more organized scale, though never an easy one. From the islands of the Pacific, from Southeast Asia, from China and Taiwan and Korea, millions of Japanese were gathered at coastal assembly points and loaded aboard whatever shipping could be found. The work was overseen by the occupation authorities, who set the schedules and allotted the ships, and it became a continuous operation that ran for years. Vessel after vessel crossed the seas between the mainland and the home islands, packed with passengers far beyond any peacetime standard. Holds and decks crowded with people and the few belongings they were permitted to carry. The crossings were grim. Disease moved easily through the packed ships, sanitation was poor, and the voyages, though shorter than the overland flight from Manchuria, were their own ordeal. But for most who boarded, the ship was the thing they had waited months or years to reach. The vessel that would carry them across the last stretch of water between the wreck of the empire and home.
A great share of that shipping came from the Americans, and there is something worth pausing on in that fact. The Liberty ships, the plain, mass-produced cargo vessels that the United States had built in astonishing numbers to keep the war supplied, were among the workhorses pressed into the repatriation. The same industrial flood that had helped strangle Japan's own merchant fleet, that had carried the armies and the materiel that defeated the empire, now carried that empire's stranded people home. There is a quiet irony in it. The homecoming of the Japanese nation rode in part on the hulls of the country that had beaten it. But there was nothing sentimental about the arrangement. The occupation authorities had a practical interest in clearing millions of Japanese out of the territories being handed to new governments and back to China, Korea, and the colonial powers. And the fastest way to do that was to put holes in the water. So the ships ran, month after month, carrying the defeated home in the holds of the victors' freighters.
And so the ports filled. Maizuru on the Sea of Japan coast, and Sasebo in the southwest, together with a handful of other designated harbors, took in the returning millions in an unbroken procession of ships. To arrive was not simply to step ashore. The returnees passed through reception centers built to process them, medical inspection and quarantine, because disease came in with the ships and the home islands could not afford an epidemic. Registration to record who had come back and reconnect them, if possible, with families and home regions. The issuing of small allowances and rations to people who often arrived with nothing but what they wore. For many, the most wrenching part was not the crossing, but this moment of arrival. The recognition that the country they had longed for through years of hardship was itself broken, hungry and crowded, with cities burned, food short, and that coming home did not mean coming back to anything like the life they had left. They had reached Japan, but Japan, in 1945 and the lean years that followed, was a hard place to come home to.
The ports themselves became something more than transit points. They became places of memory. Maizuru, in particular, because it received the latecomers, the repatriation camps from the Soviet camps, returning across the late 1940s and after, became bound up with the image of waiting. Families came to the quay when a ship was due and stood watching the gangway, scanning the faces of the returning for one they knew, sometimes for years, sometimes in vain. A returning ship was hope and dread in the same hull. It might carry a husband, a son,
a father long given up for dead. It might dock and unload and not carry him at all. That image, the watcher at the pier, the ship coming in, the homecoming that arrives for some, never for others, became one of the defining pictures of the war's long ending in Japan. The repatriation was not a single event, but a slow, years-long tide of arrivals. And the ports where it broke onto the home islands carried the weight of every family it touched, and everyone it disappointed.
But not everyone came home, and some who did not were not dead. Among the most haunting consequences of the flight from Manchuria were the children. Japanese children, separated from their families in the chaos of the collapse and left behind on the continent. The circumstances were as varied as they were terrible. In the desperate flight south, some children were lost from their families in the confusion of the road. Others were given away deliberately, in extremity, by parents who could not carry them, could not feed them, or were dying. Handed to Chinese families in the hope that a child taken in by strangers might at least survive, where a child kept might not. Still others survived because local Chinese families, in the middle of all that had been done to their own country, chose to take in and raise the abandoned children of the people who had occupied it. However it happened, the result was the same. Thousands of Japanese children remained in China when the ship sailed, growing up in Chinese families, speaking Chinese, often not even knowing for certain that they had been born Japanese.
These children have a name in Japanese: the zanryu koji, the orphans left behind in China. And their story did not end with the war or with the repatriation that followed it. It stretched on for decades. As the children grew into adults inside Chinese families, the political wall that fell between Japan and the People's Republic of China after the war sealed them off. For a long time, there was no way for them to search, and often no knowledge that there was anyone searching for them. Many had been too young at the separation to remember their original names, their home regions, even the faces of their parents. They lived entire lives, childhood, work, marriage, children of their own, as members of the country that had taken them in. While in Japan, parents and siblings who had survived the flight wondered for the rest of their lives what had become of the child lost on the road out of Manchuria.
These children have a name in Japanese: the zanryu koji, the orphans left behind in China. And their story did not end with the war or with the repatriation that followed it. It stretched on for decades. As the children grew into adults inside Chinese families, the political wall that fell between Japan and the People's Republic of China after the war sealed them off. For a long time, there was no way for them to search, and often no knowledge that there was anyone searching for them. Many had been too young at the separation to remember their original names, their home regions, even the faces of their parents. They lived entire lives, childhood, work, marriage, children of their own, as members of the country that had taken them in. While in Japan, parents and siblings who had survived the flight wondered for the rest of their lives what had become of the child lost on the road out of Manchuria.
The story of the left-behind orphans is the sharpest point of a larger truth about the whole repatriation: that the end of the war did not fall evenly, and that for some, it never fully arrived at all. The vast majority of the 6.5 million did come home over months and years through the ports and the reception centers and the crowded ships. But the repatriation left a long tail of the unreturned and unaccounted. The dead of the Manchurian flight who never reached a port, the prisoners held for years in Soviet camps, the children grown old in Chinese villages, the families who waited at the quay at Maizuru for a face that never came down the gangway. These were not statistics to the people who lived them.
they were the specific shape that the defeat took in millions of individual lives. A defeat measured not in territory lost, but in the years it took to come home, and in the ones who never did. The surrender ended the fighting in a single broadcast. The war itself, for the people scattered across the wreck of the empire, ended one ship at a time, one road at a time, over a decade and more.
There is something singular about a defeat whose hardest chapter comes after the surrender. We are used to thinking of a war as ending when the guns stop and the documents are signed. But for an empire that had spread its own people across half a continent, the signing of the surrender was the moment the real ordeal began for millions of them. The Hikiage, the Great Repatriation, was the war turning inside out. Instead of armies flowing outward to conquer, an entire population flowing back across the same seas and roads in defeat and disorder. Roughly 6.5 million people made that journey over years. And the country that received them was itself on its knees, burned, hungry, and crowded, asked to absorb millions of returning mouths at the very moment it could least afford to feed them. That Japan managed it at all, that the repatriation was completed and the returnees folded back into a recovering nation, is one of the quiet, enormous facts of the post-war years. It was a homecoming the size of a nation, carried out in the ruins of one. And the journey marked the people who made it for the rest of their lives. To be a repatriate, a Hikiage Sha, was to carry a particular experience that those who had stayed in the home islands did not share. The loss of a home and a life built somewhere else, the flight, the camps, the crossing, the arrival with nothing in a country that had no room to spare. Many had lost family along the road. Many returned to find that the relatives and the homes they had hoped to come back to were gone, killed in the bombing, or scattered, or simply unable to take them in. They rebuilt as the whole country rebuilt, but the experience set them apart, and the memory of the repatriation, the ships, the ports, the ones who did not return, became a thread running quietly through the generation that lived it. The monuments and the memorial halls that later rose at the repatriation ports were built for them, an acknowledgement that the homecoming had been an ordeal, and that the ones who came through it had crossed something that deserved to be remembered.
There is a final meaning in the repatriation, and it concerns the gap between how a war ends on paper and how it ends in lives. The surrender of Japan is a date, a single day in the late summer of 1945. But the Hikiage shows that the date is almost a fiction when set against the experience of the people. For the settler family fleeing Manchuria in the snow, the war did not end in August. It was only beginning its worst phase. For the prisoner in a Siberian camp, it ended years later, if he lived. For the orphan raised in a Chinese village, it did not end until a reunion decades on, or it never ended at all. The repatriation is the proof that the close of a war is not a line, but a long, ragged unwinding, paid out unevenly across millions of lives. The negative space of this story is all the homecomings that never happened, the ships that came in without the awaited face, the roads that swallowed the families who set out on them, the children who grew old under another sky. 6.5 million were brought home. The measure of the war is also in the ones who were not.
The repatriation was the human reckoning of the lost empire. Millions of ordinary people carried home or lost in the slow unwinding of a war that ended on paper years before it ended in their lives. But while the nation gathered its scattered people from the sea, something else was still out there, unaccounted for, in the jungles and the islands the ships had left behind. Not every soldier surrendered when the broadcast came. On remote islands across the Pacific,
a handful of men did not believe the war was over, or refused to accept it, and went on hiding and fighting in the green, holding their posts, following their last orders, waiting for a relief that would never come. Some held out for years. A few held out for decades, emerging at last from the jungle into a world that had moved on without them. Soldiers of a war that everyone else had finished long before. Next, on Taurophiles, the last holdouts of the Pacific, the men who never got the order to stop, and the one who kept fighting his war almost 30 years after it ended. Taurophiles tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.